our products with a gut healthy ingredient called gum acacia. And what gum acacia, and I was referring to the T-shirt earlier, is that um, gum acacia is a prebiotic which helps feed probiotics, and probiotics are, and I'm sure Patrick will go into this, or maybe not, but it, they're the good gut bugs, if you will. So the good gut bugs are now being understood to help athletes' performance and also improve the sustainability of your immune system. So those are pretty critical in these days and times. And as an athlete, we always want to see we want to reach our maximum performance. So um, we really need to be paying more attention, as Patrick will validate, to how to enhance the gastrointestinal system, and finding ingredients that are easier to absorb into your body so they're less taxing, more natural ingredients that are not synthetic and plant-based. And that's really what Moxie Life Nutrition is all about. We look at every ingredient that goes into our products to look at, number one, the clinical verification of its validity and absorbability and non-synthetic aspect of it. So I think our conversation and Patrick's uh, meeting today will be of extreme interest to me, and I hope that your takeaways are going to be enlightened.
So Teresa Sequist is a sponsor. She has an amazing product line called Moxie Life, and Hydromag is one of the products I take constantly. It's a magnesium product. So she was just explaining it to the group. And now that you're on, and I'm so glad that you were able to get on, I just want to introduce Patrick to everyone. So this is Patrick's book, The Athlete's Gut. I have a copy of it. I had gotten a copy from Velo Press a while back, and I did a little review of it. It was an amazing book. And then I saw Patrick on the USA Triathlon webinar series, and I asked him, I said, please, you've got to do a webinar for us. This was so great. So without further ado, Patrick, I'm going to let you take it over. I will, if you have a PowerPoint, you can use it, and we'll have some time for questions and answers after.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't have a formal presentation, so I guess I was thinking we would probably just do more of like a Q&A for people who have questions, and that works for me. But yeah, I'm obviously the author of The Athlete's Gut, and the gut is something that I'm interested in terms of athletic performance and how people feel and function, how they train, how they perform, how they recover. So there's a lot of aspects of the gut that can potentially impact somebody's performance and how they train. So in the book, basically, I go through, essentially what the gut is, all the components of the gut, and then all the various problems that athletes can sort of run into or encounter during training and competition. And it kind of ranges a lot from very severe things like nausea and vomiting, to cramping, things that'll actually stop a competitor during a race, to more nuisance type problems like, gas, burping, things that generally speaking don't cause an athlete, enough of a problem to stop a race or stop training. So it's a big spectrum. So I go through basically all those symptoms individually in the second chapter of the book, talk about what are some of the potential causes of each of those symptoms. Because one of the, I think, the important things to think about if you experience gut problems is, we kind of lump them all together, but oftentimes each of these symptoms can have kind of unique causes. So for example, things that trigger nausea are going to be different from things that trigger abdominal cramping in some cases. So one of the things I think can be helpful for athletes is to document what are the actual symptoms they're experiencing. Does it tend to be a certain 2 or 3 symptoms? And then that can help guide, potentially what will be the underlying issues for that particular person. In other cases, they just kind of experience a whole bunch of different symptoms, and that could be more related to an underlying gastrointestinal disorder like IBS or Crohn's or celiac or something like that. So it really depends. There's a lot of things that can cause gut problems. So rarely is it just one thing you do and then you've now fixed your gut problems. So it tends to be a multi-pronged approach for a lot of people to get a handle on some of their issues. So that was kind of the impetus or the goal for writing the book, is to try and help people understand what are some of the possibilities with respect to their gut problems, specifically with exercise and training, and then give them some potential tools to, help address those problems. So that's kind of an overview of what I'm interested in the book. But I mean, I would definitely, be fine answering questions or specific areas or topics that you'd like to talk about.
Great. So I'll open it up. I mean, I guess I'll start with my questions. So Joanne and I, we ran a race upstate New York. And I guess it was toward the end of the race where both of us were like, oh my God, we have to like go to the bathroom. I mean, this is like serious, Let me ask you something. Is there anything that you could do during a race like that, to prevent it, or what can you do?
And was the distance of the race?
It wasn't that long. I mean, it was only a half marathon, but it was like the last, I guess, mile 12 that we were like, okay, now we got to hustle.
Right. And was it a hot day or was it normal temperature? What was kind of the conditions?
I don't remember. Joanne, do you remember? You're on mute.
Mute.
On mute, yeah. I think it was getting hot, and I kind of felt it was just too much of a coincidence that we both at the same time had this burst in our stomach. I think it could have been the water. I don't know. One of our water stations that we stopped at, but it was hot. It was getting hot.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly an extremely common phenomenon amongst runners. I mean, there's a number of things that kind of correlate with an increase in those types of symptoms. And part of the reason why I was asking about the weather is that is one very consistent thing that triggers more severe issues. So, that includes both kind of upper symptoms and lower symptoms. So there's been some studies that have asked people to exercise in a hot environment. They put them in a chamber where they crank up the temperature, crank up the humidity, and then compare that to when they exercise in a more temperate environment. We do see most symptoms are worse in a hot environment. So if for example, an athlete was struggling with gut issues during a summer race or training, that could be partly induced by the weather. And what you might be aware of or just try and do, is to kind of acclimate to that environment, gradually increase your intensity in training to make sure you're not overdoing it in that hot environment. But to some extent, those problems are just going to be more common if you are exercising in a really strenuous kind of set of environmental conditions. Of course, things you eat can be a problem, and there's a whole bunch of things that could potentially trigger those issues. It's a little bit challenging to go through all those possibilities, but for example, I'll give you one. There's some studies that suggest some people are really sensitive to what are called Fodmaps. They're fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. We use the term Fodmap. They're basically short chain carbohydrates that are in foods that some people don't absorb and digest very well if they eat a lot of them in their diet. And whenever you have a sugar or carbohydrate that you eat that isn't absorbed, it stays in the gut. And that causes problems because water will be pulled out into the intestinal tract. Those carbohydrates will get fermented in your large intestine. So that means gas, loose stools, bloating. And there are some studies that suggest if you take an athlete who's eating a lot of FODMAPs and reduce that amount, let's say 24 hours before a race or 2 days before a race, it can reduce symptoms to a degree. So, that's one other example of something that a choice you make in the days leading up to a race that may be an issue for some athletes. Another one would be anxiety and stress. And that's something that I've actually done a few studies on myself. We're actually doing a few studies on it right now. We're doing some interventions with runners, athletes, people who do aerobic exercise, and we're either using relaxing music or deep breathing type interventions to try and see if that helps with gut issues. If anyone are interested in that, feel free to send me an email. But we have done a couple of studies that have shown that there is an association between higher anxiety levels and certain types of gut issues. So on the morning of a race, if you're really nervous, really stressed, it seems more likely you're going to deal with those issues. And maybe it would be worthwhile, trying deep breathing or other sort of things that could reduce your sort of, sympathetic stress response. So those are at least a few things that could be going on there. But, lots of things can cause an urge to use the bathroom. And, it's a bit of a challenge sometimes to pin down exactly what it is in one single situation.
Yeah, for me, just the anxiety of right before a race, I have to use the bathroom. And like now it's to the point where just like over planning to do that beforehand. And then, like my thought process is that maybe it's not the foods that I'm eating, but the different supplements that I'm taking ahead of time to kind of prepare for the race. So I guess my question is like, what do you recommend is like as a baseline that like the plainest things that you can do to help prevent this? Because that's like the day before a race, I tend to eat more on the plain side, like plain chicken, because I want to try to avoid eating things that are going to trigger that. So I mean, in general, I would say eating things that you're accustomed to that are on the plainer side can be helpful for some athletes, especially if like you have a lot of urges to use the restroom. I mean, that can possibly help. But in some cases, like if you're really anxious, it doesn't necessarily matter probably what you're eating, because that can cause sort of motility changes in the gut itself. It can cause an increase in motility in the large intestine. So it may not actually matter so much what you eat if you're still struggling with those anxiety issues. And anxiety definitely does it. Like when I had a scenario with my boyfriend who was rushed to the hospital in December, and my immediate response was to go to the bathroom. And he's laying on the floor. I mean, he was okay, but I had to be in the bathroom the whole time.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So I that's something you would work with, trying maybe a professional who is better with those interventions that
I've been therapy for, like to help like kind of move yourself out of that trigger place and mind shift a little bit.
And it's interesting because there's a couple anecdotes I use in the book. One of them was a study I found down back in the 50s, where they used basically a scope, put it into it was a medical residence or medical student's colon essentially, and lied to him about there being a like cancerous looking growth, just to see what it would do to the motility of his colon. Now they eventually told him that he did not have a cancerous growth in his colon, but they were using that as a way to manipulate sort of his level of stress and anxiety. Now that's certainly a questionable research design in 2021, but in 1940, whatever it was, 50, that was allowable. The other interesting anecdotes are people who have had what are called fistulas into their stomach or the intestine, basically an opening where you can see inside. And that's where we actually started to learn from a very basic level that the way that you feel affects function in the gut. So there was this gentleman, Alexis St. Martin, who is a fur trader, who was basically shot in the stomach accidentally and it never healed. So you could see inside his stomach, and a physician who initially treated him ended up kind of hiring him as an indentured servant and doing a bunch of experiments on him. And based on some of his experiments, you could simply look inside his stomach and see that depending on his mood states, his stress, how he's feeling, you could see color changes in the actual lining of the stomach, which suggests changes in blood flow. So the idea being sometimes when you're really stressed, anxious, there's a reduction in blood flow to certain parts of the gut, and then even an increase in activity in other parts, like the large intestine. So yeah, there's a bunch of different research that tells us that the way that you feel mentally is going to impact, your gastrointestinal system. And if you have gut symptoms, it can also impact the way that you feel mentally. There's kind of this bi-directional communication between, the gut and the brain. They're very intertwined. So it's been a little bit of an underappreciated problem or issue, at least amongst athletes. Psychological issues, stress, anxiety, potentially playing a role in some of their issues. So we're trying to do some intervention studies now, like I mentioned. They're 100% virtual, where we're trying to use some interventions, pretty risk-free, like relaxing music and breathing exercises to try and address some of those problems.
There are 2 questions in the queue. The first question is on sugar and its effect on the GI, dehydration and bloating, and also inflammation associated with excessive sugar. Can you address that? And then I have another question for you.
Sure. I mean, sugar, it's one of those things that can certainly be performance enhancing when a person is doing really high intensity exercise that's of a prolonged duration. So, if you're going for more than 60 to 90 minutes, that tends to be the situation where consuming some sort of sugar-based or carbohydrate-based supplement can be helpful for improving performance. Now, like anything, if you overload the gut or the intestines with sort of any nutrients, it can cause problems. So we know that sometimes athletes, when they overdo supplement intake or overdo sugar intake, some of that sugar does not get absorbed particularly well. And it can cause bloating, it can cause cramping, loose stools. So I would say, definitely pay attention to the amount that you're ingesting and start off gradually, work your way up if you're trying to target, some sort of fairly high intake. That's something you definitely want to practice repeatedly before you really would implement that, like during a race or something. Now, there are certain sugars that are not well absorbed in some people, like lactose is a very easy example. A significant chunk of people are a little bit what we call lactose malabsorbers. Maybe if you give them more than something like 10 grams at once, they tend to have problems. Another example would be fructose malabsorption. There's a certain segment of the population that does not absorb fructose as well. Almost everybody would be a fructose malabsorber if you gave them enough fructose. Like if you gave 100 people 100 grams of fructose at once, most of them would not absorb all that 100 grams. So it's a spectrum. Some people are a little bit better than others at absorbing fructose. So if you were consuming something that had a lot of fructose in it, that could be potentially a problem for some individuals. So what you would do is, either reduce the fructose you're ingesting, or there are some studies that suggest if you just consume some glucose with it, it largely takes care of that fructose malabsorption problem. Because when you ingest glucose with it, it kind of brings the fructose along when it gets absorbed. So, there's a number of ways you can kind of go about dealing with that sugar malabsorption problem. It just depends on the person and maybe what type of sugar they're having issues with.
Okay, the next question is, this is from a person who has celiac disease. She's already on a GFDF diet. I'm not sure what that is. Low in Fodmaps, I guess.
So the Fodmaps you're talking about,
okay.
Yep.
All right. If we know gut issues affect so many athletes, why do races continue to have so much processed foods full of things like corn, cookies, grains, electrolytes on drinks, that cause gut issues in long races?
I think it's, it's partly you've got a certain segment of athletes, exercisers who do have those issues. They're sensitive to certain things in food, and then probably a larger chunk that aren't as sensitive. So, why races choose to have certain foods available and not others, I think it's largely convenience, largely marketing. I mean, there's not any necessarily reason why certain formulated sport nutrition products are any better than a natural source of sugar. So to some extent, I think it's just convenience, marketing, that sort of stuff. Being able to provide things in bulk that are not going to go bad. I think it's more practical than probably a conscious choice among a lot of race directors. That said, I think, again, it's a subset of people who have those issues. I've had people in our lab, you can give them a high dose of a sports beverage or a supplement, and they have no problems. Others, you give them a smaller, moderate dose, and they have lots of problems. So it's a very individual thing. And it comes down to sort of trying to figure out for you specifically, can you identify your own triggers or things that are causing you problems as a way to maybe try and deal with them on an individual basis? Because again, there's a lot of variability between people in terms of what is causing them problems. I will say FODMAPs are actually also high in kind of natural foods. So there's certain fruits and vegetables that are high in FODMAPs. So just eliminating like processed stuff would not address that particular problem.
Okay, that was it for the Q. So if anybody else has questions, Steve, it looks like you have a question. No? Yes? You're on mute though.
No, not a question, just, sharing my own experience. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to read your book because I like to dive a little deeper into what you have to offer. But I found in my experience, like most of us do, is that most of our experiences are fairly predictable at this point because we have our routines. We do our certain things, and we know what some of the triggers might be. I know for me, I know this isn't maybe not very polite discussion, but we're talking about the gut. Historically, regardless of what time of day, what my diet is, whatever's going on, if I go out specifically for a run, almost predictably within the first, say, mile to 2 miles or 15, 20 minutes, okay, I've got to go. Okay. So I've just built this into my repertoire. I know that whatever's going on, I have to build that in. Okay, race day, I know I've learned to get there plenty early, just do a long warm up. Once things start going, motility starts, moving, I know what to expect. I'm not saying that it's a problem for me because it's just how my gut seems to work. Doesn't seem to matter what I've been eating or anything that's going on. But I'd like to dive a little deeper into your book to find out just what's behind all the science.
Yeah, I mean that's a good example though of using your own experience to try and adjust what you're doing to maybe help deal with that problem. So at least that you're moving before the race, it's going to happen, so you kind of get it out of the way. I mean, yeah, exercise, physical activity does also seem to increase gut motility. So there's probably not a whole lot you can do about that besides be aware of that and make adjustments to the timing of your warm up and things like that. Maybe trying to minimize or reduce stress and anxiety so that's not completely out of control. But yeah, to some extent, some of these problems are unavoidable. Another example I like to cite is in ultra races. I mean, the prevalence of nausea in ultra races is as high as 60%. So you're not going to get rid of nausea in every single person. It's just not going to happen. There are some things you can tweak to maybe reduce the severity, reduce the chances of it happening frequently. But I definitely write the book in a way that it's not promising to fix every single gut problem. I try and provide the information, use a very scientific-based approach, give some strategies that might be helpful, but I definitely don't promise things in terms of this is going to cure your gut problems because they are very challenging to identify and really get a handle on and completely eliminate. It's just the truth. You know, some people take a different approach and will say that, oh, just take this supplement or start this diet and, you know, you're going to fix all your problems. I don't think that's likely to be true, especially with the gut.
Cool.
So I have a question about the pre-race nutrition, especially if you know your race is going to be on a warm or even a hot day. Besides being well hydrated, are there any particular nutrients that you should focus on prior to a warm rate or a warm or hot race day?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are a couple of things people could try with the idea that you're anticipating it going to be hot, that you're probably going to be sweating more. So I think the two that have been used kind of in that scenario would be either loading with kind of a sodium-rich fluid in the hours beforehand, or the alternative has been using glycerol. Glycerol is basically a 3-carbon molecule that is usually a part of triglycerides or fats. Glycerol was once banned by WADA because it was used to mask other types of substances, but it's since been allowed. I would say the safest of those two options between glycerol and sodium would be the sodium option. So there's at least a few studies that I've had people do a protocol where starting maybe a couple hours before exercise in a hot environment, they drink a very sodium-rich beverage. And the idea there is that if you're consuming a good amount of sodium with the fluid, it ends up being retained in your body at a higher rate. Like if you just drink a lot of plain water, some of that is going to be retained, but a larger percentage of what you consume is actually going to be put out in your urine over the next couple of hours. So if you consume it with some extra sodium, you're basically like fluid loading. It's kind of the same concept as carbohydrate loading, except for in this case, you're sort of loading yourself with fluid, or at least maintaining a higher percentage of what you ingested by including a fairly large amount of sodium in those beverages that you're consuming, starting again probably a few hours, couple hours before the race. Now, this is a pretty large amount of sodium. So if you just dumped like table salt into water, it's probably not going to taste very good. There are some companies that have made products. I've got one in my, not to plug a product, I'm just trying to remember. Osmo is one. The Right Stuff is another. So there's a couple of actual sport nutrition companies that have come up with products that could be used that way if you didn't want to try and make your own beverage. Now, how effective is that going to be? I think it depends on how long the race is, how much you drink during the race itself. I think one advantage of trying something like that is theoretically you could maybe get away with drinking less fluid during the event because you've already kind of hyperhydrated yourself. You've loaded with fluid a little bit beforehand. So maybe that would allow you to drink a more gut-friendly volume of fluid during the race itself and maintain an adequate amount of hydration. Beyond that, choosing a cooler fluid, obviously choosing something that's cooler in temperature during the race, not using something that obviously is a hot beverage that goes without saying, I think, but that's one of the other nutritional things you could do that helps mitigate some of that heat stress.
What do you think about goo, gels?
Specific products, there's just so many products on the market. I mean, if you add up all the gels, the blocks, the chews, I mean, there's hundreds of different products, and a lot of them have a lot of the same basic formulations. They like to market that they're very different, but to be honest, if you look at the basic ingredients for most of these products, they're not completely dissimilar. So I think it ultimately comes down to your taste preference, trying them individually to see if you have any bad reactions, and just using your experience to pick a product that works for you. A lot of it is just marketing that tries to separate individual products from one another. When reality you look at the ingredients, they're not usually terribly different. I'm not going to say good or bad things about goo specifically. I think they're a reasonable choice to try.
What are your thoughts on caffeine on the digestive tract too? Because a lot of those supplements and pre-workouts, they're all loaded with caffeine, and I happen to love coffee as well.
Yep. Yeah, that's one I think sometimes people can underappreciate its effects on the gut. So, caffeine is one that is definitely dose dependent. So a small amount goes a far way to maybe helping you feel better and improve your ability to sustain a higher pace during a race. And larger amounts can maybe do the same thing, but also can cause gut issues. So certainly nausea is more likely with high dosages of caffeine, and it perhaps increases in, large intestine kind of motility, abdominal cramping, things like that, with high dosages. And by high dose, I mean probably, something like more than, probably 300 or 400 milligrams in one sitting. So you'd have to drink probably at least a few cups of coffee to get to that high dosage. So obviously caffeine content varies a lot between beverages, so it's going to depend on what you're drinking. I would say it's most common to be a problem for people who are fasting. So they didn't eat anything. They haven't eaten anything for a while. So their body's already releasing stress hormones. Okay, when you don't eat something for a while, your body releases adrenaline, other hormones that try and keep your blood glucose at a kind of normal level. So if you throw caffeine, especially a lot of caffeine on top of that, that's an extra release of adrenaline. And that adrenaline can trigger nausea and GI issues. So I think mixing lots of caffeine with not eating any energy, and then also if you're stressed, that's a bad recipe for gut issues. So I think sometimes people are, I'm tired, I didn't sleep well, I didn't eat much, I'll just have some coffee. That may not be the best approach in terms of GI issues for some people who are sensitive, to caffeine. I'm a person who's sensitive to caffeine in terms of the kind of feeling jittery, anxious. So I don't do huge dosages of caffeine. I've actually had my genetic profile tested, and I'm the type of person that has basically a version of a gene that would suggest I am more responsive to caffeine in terms of getting anxious. So my own personal experience matches my genetic profile.
It helps. Yeah, because I mean, when you think about like if you're taking a pre-workout and all these other things, can wind up really adding up.
Yeah.
The goose have it. You had coffee in the morning and you didn't sleep well, because I never sleep well before a race either. So.
And it's also important to consider that, especially with coffee, there's a huge variability, and even day to day, the same sort of order that you get from Starbucks. There's some interesting studies that have shown it can vary from 50 milligrams per serving to over 200 milligrams per serving at the same establishment with the same order on different days. So if you want like a really precise dosage of caffeine, coffee's, I think it's okay to use, but it's not the most precise way to dose caffeine if that's something you're interested in, getting a very specific amount. So just kind of keep that in mind.
And what about acidophilus? I know that that's always something talked about with like, keeping a clean gut and stuff like that. Do you feel that it benefits us as athletes to have a healthy or put that in our diet?
For probiotics, you mean?
Yeah.
I think, the probiotic question is interesting. There are some situations where specifically like supplementing with a probiotic could be helpful. And it probably is more in people who actually have like diagnosed IBS, or you're going to be taking an antibiotic, like you've been prescribed an antibiotic for whatever reason by your physician. In those situations, there's actually pretty good evidence from clinical trials that probiotics can be helpful for reducing the severity of symptoms or issues that people experience. Not dramatically, but modestly. Okay, these are usually modest benefits. Now, in terms of like probiotic containing foods, yogurt, fermented foods, those sort of things, I think they're certainly good to include in your diet. Whether the dosage is enough and consistent enough to really address a specific issue that somebody might have, like IBS or other health issues, I think if you really want, a specific probiotic at a specific dosage, you should probably go with an actual supplement. It's more likely to get you to the amount that would be needed to elicit a positive effect. I'm not saying don't include those fermented foods in your diet. I think those are good things that may promote a healthy gut over the long term. But if you have like a specific goal in mind, you know, preventing diarrhea from antibiotic therapy or reducing your IBS symptoms, then I would say, you know, it's probably better for the person to actually take a probiotic pill or supplement.
So I have a question in the queue.
I will just say for athletes, probiotics have not been shown to really dramatically reduce GI symptoms, maybe mildly, but they don't seem to be super effective at reducing GI problems in most runners or athletes, maybe modestly effective.
I have two more questions in the queue. One is about DNA testing to get, you know, can you talk a little bit more about DNA testing to get more of a genetic profile on nutrition?
Sure. It's a very early science, and I think the marketing is way ahead of what it can usually tell you. I went with caffeine genetic testing because I think that's a little bit more simplistic. It's a little bit more straightforward in terms of how fast you metabolize caffeine. Other genetic tests that supposedly tell you about what foods you're supposed to eat, they're pretty sketchy in terms of the science, I think, at this point. Or at least they're not really well supported in terms of really helping people make changes that are going to be better than just following normal, you know, dietary guidance. But yeah, there are some companies that will test your genotype for various genes that are involved in metabolizing caffeine or how you respond to caffeine. Are you sort of a fast metabolizer or slow metabolizer? And then in your brain, you know, how do you respond to caffeine in terms of the receptors that bind to caffeine? So I don't remember the name of the company that I specifically went with, but there's a variety of them that do offer that kind of testing. You know, is it really necessary? I don't really know that it is. I think most people are pretty good about guesstimating, am I somebody who does not respond well to a lot of caffeine, right? You just take a few cups of coffee at full dose and you can probably figure out whether or not you're the type of person who doesn't feel well after that. So I don't know that it's really worth it. I was more interested just from a scientific perspective. It didn't really change anything that I was doing. It just sort of reaffirmed to me that my subjective experience kind of lined up with what the test had said in terms of my anxiety response to ingesting too much caffeine. In general, I think genetic testing for nutrition is very early, and it's questionable how much it actually improves people's health. When they get the test, does that actually lead to better health in the long run? I don't know that there's good evidence that that's the case right now.
Okay, the other question in the queue is, how does the gut influence histamine release?
There are medications that target histamine pathways in terms of, treating, too much acid secretion in the gut, things like that. Honestly, that's not something that I went through in the book. So anything that I would say at this point would just be kind of speculating or guessing. So I don't have a good answer for that off the top of my head.
Anybody else have any questions? Nicole, Louisa, Jackie? No, we're all good. All right. Well, then I think you've answered it all, Patrick. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to hold up Patrick's book again. It's The Athlete's Gut. You can find it on Amazon. And we very, very much appreciate you coming today. Thank you very much for all your information. We appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thanks.
Hey,
Bye-bye.
thank you.
Thank you. Bye.